want to take a moment to recognize how lovely Israeli women are. That being said, roll tape. Happy Sabbath day that the Lord made, that Jesus is Lord of, that we keep as believers because we honor Jesus as the creator. And we understand that our faith is a Hebrew faith that comes from what was established in the first century with first covenant people. And so we honor that by honoring the fact that our faith is a Hebrew faith. Okay, so here's my question. And this is a fact-finding mission. You guys can help me understand, because this is how it looks to me with this modern understanding of dispensationalism. So first, I want to say this. I think what's happening in Israel is terrible for both sides. I believe in a Western democracy. So as it sits now, I am for Israel. I'm not for the death of Palestinians, but it's very complicated. So I think the Israelis should have a democracy in the land. I think they're good stewards of the land. So I'm not anti-Israel. I'm pro-Israel. In that sense, anyways. Okay. Not because I think the Bible is foretelling it, but just because that's how I see the current circumstances and the way of governing and where we find ourselves. I don't think the Israelis should be kicked out of the land. They should. I am for their democracy as it stands. So this has nothing to do with me being anti-Israel whatsoever. I'm pro-Israel. Okay. But here's my question. I don't get it. Do you take the Bible literally in this sense about Israel and you divorce the church from Israel because you're confused and you don't want to keep the Sabbath or whatever, and you don't want to recognize that the church is a Hebrew faith established by Hebrews and Jesus in the first century, and you deny this, which I think is a huge mistake. And you actually are the actual replacement theologians because you've replaced the true faith that is a Jewish Hebrew faith, and you make the church this other entity, and that God's going to bring back the Mosaic covenant for the Jews, which makes no sense because Jesus is the savior to the Jew first. I don't get it. Please help me understand where you're coming from. I believe that you are very mistaken and you don't understand the Bible, but I'm willing to listen. And I have been listening for a while now, as best as I can. There's so many different ways of understanding this, because it seems like people recognize to varying degrees the things that I recognize, and so they have to diverge, but they keep these same core principles of dispensationalism and they go astray in some other way. And then now there's this cloud of different ideas that totally obscures, and all this obfuscation about replacement theology. You guys are the replacement theologians because you don't recognize the Hebrew faith as being what it is and established by Jesus in the first century. But tell me, this is the part I don't get. I'm an Adventist. We believe that about the faith being the full plan of salvation, being an expansion of the Hebrew faith in the first century, because God was calling back all the nations to himself, which were astray, starting in Eden when the fall happened. And God saw fit to bring that salvation through the Jewish people and Jesus for the whole world. It's the same God, same Sabbath that God established in Eden for mankind, his benefit, to honor him as the Lord of creation. And now all this obfuscation with replacement theology, which is kind of a replacement theology classically, the covenant theology is, because they took that faith and went their own way with it. This is what was prophesied in Daniel, that he would change God's law. We're Adventists, we're saying no, it's a Hebrew faith with the same God from the very beginning, and that Jesus is this God. And now people argue over who's replacement. No, you're all replacement theology. Y'all don't get it. But my question is, if you think this other thing for the Jews, because God has different purposes for the Jews rather than him using the Jews to bring forth the Messiah of humanity, and then you want to downgrade everybody else's version because it's twisted, and it is. Tell me, like, so as Adventists, we want to fight against what we think is going to happen because it's wrong. Like when we think it's a Sunday law. We think it's somebody trying to change God's times and laws. We fought that when it almost happened in the 1800s, and we'll fight it again because it's wrong, even though our prophecy predicts it. But if you think the Jews, you say you love the Jews, right? And you should love the Jews, but not because we have to, because God said, no matter what they do. You're supposed to love Jews like you're supposed to love the Palestinians and bring them the gospel. But you act like you're defending God by defending the Jews, and you want to bring them into the land because you take it literally. And your prophecy says, let me ask you, all Israel shall be saved. I think it's ridiculous if you're so extreme that you don't recognize that there's a true Israel within Israel, because you're not Calvinist, right? So election doesn't mean necessarily saved, right? Or maybe if you're extreme, you're going to say every Jew that ever lived is saved because they're Jewish, which is ridiculous and insane and unbiblical. Obviously, we know that's not true. Jesus condemned many of the people of Israel who thought they were saved because they had the right blood in their veins. Jesus said, you're of your father, the devil. Not because they're serpent seeds or Satan is literally their father because Eve had sex with Satan in the garden and there's this other line of bad people that are sons of Satan. But this is insanity. But because of whom they serve, they're sons of Satan. And so we know all Israelites aren't saved because they're related to Abraham. That's funny because we're all related to Abraham at this point if you understand how genealogies work. And once you understand that, you realize your interpretation of, not because we want to say they're not the true Jews in Israel. A true Jew is one inwardly, but that's a distraction. My point is just this. Why would you want to bring, if all Israel, unless you think every Jew is saved, and so getting the Jews killed by their enemies would just send them straight to heaven, which is retarded. So on one hand, if you think all Jews are saved by way of being related to Abraham, which makes no sense, by the way. What makes you a Jew anyways today? What if you're an atheist, but you're more related to Abraham? Are you saved? But what about the guy who is 14% Israeli, or however your criteria is for being related to Abraham that makes them a Jew? But let's say they don't meet the threshold of a certain percentage of being related, but they live in Israel and I don't know, what does it mean to be a Jew today? Does it mean you don't accept Jesus, but you say you worship the God of Israel? Does that make you a Jew? Or is it the blood? Well, what if you wholeheartedly reject Jesus and accept what has become the Jewish faith today, but you live in Israel and you outwardly reject Jesus and worship the Jewish faith as it's what it's become, but you're only 14% Israel and the threshold is 15. But you live in Israel and you are related, just not as much. And then you live in New York and you're 16%, so you meet the threshold, but you're an atheist. Is that guy a Jew? I mean, what makes it a Jew? Do you have to reject Jesus to be a Jew? Like, what does that even mean? It's ridiculous. But let's just say we want to save people who don't believe in Jesus, whether they're related to Abraham and meet a threshold or not. So what I'm not exactly sure what a Jew is to you. But let's say, since we care about all people, and we're going to say we care about these Jews, whatever your criteria is, why do you want 2/3 of them to go to Israel to be slaughtered by their enemies so that God can force the remainder of those who aren't murdered to be believers? Is that what the gospel message is? It sounds very Calvinistic to those of you who aren't Calvinistic but are gung-ho for the Jews, quote unquote Jews, whatever that means to you. I'm not denying or not. I think the people in Israel are related to Abraham, and I don't think it matters. Why do you want them? Why would you want to support them rebuilding a temple that Jesus left desolate when he brought salvation to the world, to the Jew first? Why would you want to support that, even if you think that is prophecy? From my point of view, we're going to stand for what's right, whether or not it fulfills what we believe the interpretation of prophecy is. Just like Adventists fought making a bill to enforce a Sunday law. We think that's what's going to happen, but we fought it because we think it's wrong. Why would you be for bringing the Jews to be slaughtered in Israel, even if you think that is the prophecy? You should want to fight that, Because if the prophecy said 2/3 will die in unbelief, unless you think all Jews are saved anyways, which is kind of like might as well argue that we abort all babies if you think they go to heaven or something, because that would send them straight to heaven. Like, so if you're ridiculous and you think every single Jew by way of being a Jew is saved, makes no sense. It's the same idea, but okay, now let's say you're more reasonable and you think, no, obviously Jews that die in unbelief because they need to believe the gospel would go to hell, and you probably think God sends people straight to hell and they are tortured forever, which is another conversation of why that's perverse and absolutely not biblical. But let's say you do believe that. Why would you want to send Jews because you love the Jews, you're going to send them into and to fulfill the prophecy because you love them, but most of them are going to die and go straight to hell if you're a reasonable, quote unquote, reasonable doctrinally, which you're not, because so let's say it would be absurd to think every single Jew is saved even when they're murdered in unbelief in the land because you think the prophecy is literal. I guess, and I'm not sure which to think is more ridiculous, that you think the Jews in their unbelief by getting them murdered would send them straight to heaven, because even in their unbelief, just because they happen to be Jews. That's ridiculous. But there's a sense that that's more reasonable than, say, thinking what's more realistic, in that if you're a Jew and you die in unbelief, you're not saved. That would obviously be correct. Why would you want to send them to that fate rather than keep them from that fate, even if you think it's prophetic? Does Jesus want you to make that happen? Where 2/3 of the Jews are to be killed, and you say you love the Jews, so you want to make this happen. You're all gung-ho about Israel and the red heifer and bringing, this is perverse. You people are perverted. You're so confused, it's outrageous. Even if you were right about your interpretation of prophecy, why would you want to make that happen and say you love the Jews and then denigrate people who don't? No, if you love the Jews, you want to keep it from happening, even though it would make prophecy come true. This is deluded, delusionary, insanity. None of you people love the Jews. You love to make your faith, it's a misunderstanding of the Bible, come true, and with a guise of loving the Jews, as you disparage everyone who you claim doesn't love the Jews because they don't support Israel, so that they can go to the land to be murdered and go straight to hell, in your imaginary hell that's not biblical, because you love the Jews. Humanity is insane, and may God have mercy on all your souls.